Mingalaba, for any Burmese language speakers tuning in today, we wanted to let you know that our Better Burma mission has launched 3 Burmese language podcasts: Myanmar Revolutionary Tales, Dark Era of Burma, and Myanmar Peace, Women, and Security. These programs can be found on our website as well as on any of your preferred podcast platforms. We invite you to take a listen. But for now, let's get on with this episode.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. This is our third interview where we are joined once again by Zach Abuza. And today we're going to be looking at a number of different topics. We're going to be jumping around a little bit, covering the state of the conflict, the state of the national unity government, the state of the economy, and anything else that happens to come up in our meandering discussion, which whichever direction it goes in is going to prove to be fruitful and insightful. So for those who have not listened to the first 2 episodes, Zach, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Zach Abuza, and I am a professor at the National War College in the United States, where I specialize in Southeast Asian security and politics. I've been covering insurgencies and peace processes and political violence for 30 years.
Okay, thank you. So on that topic of insurgency and political violence, we're going to kick off on a somewhat controversial topic, but an extremely important topic, and that is war crimes. And controversially enough, the war crimes specifically that are being committed and that are being alleged to be committed by the pro-democracy forces in Myanmar. Now, we know of a number of cases where enemies that have been captured, soldiers that have been captured, have been mistreated by PDF, have been executed by PDF, PDF being the cover term for many of the resistance, combat resistance groups. We also recently have a video that came out of a teacher who was accused of being an informant for the military in Tamil, who was also killed by PDF based on allegations of collusion. What can you say of the state of war crimes being committed by pro-democracy forces? Is it a rampant problem? How does it compare to the military's crimes? What perspective can we take on this?
Every day when you start going through the news of what's happened in Myanmar, you're confronted with just a barrage of war crimes. Yesterday, it was photos of 13 Rohingya men and boys piled up on the side of the road. We know the military attacks in Saigon, burning down villages after village, intentionally targeting civilians when one of their lorries hits a landmine. So the atrocities that are coming out of the country are happening many times a day, every day. It's been a big concern for the NUG, whether their own PDFs, those in their direct chain of command, or those who are simply fighting the military on their own, if they commit war crimes. And war crimes are a fact of war. They are going to happen. The question is whether the NUG can get their PDFs and get within their chain of command the importance of maintaining the moral high ground. There have been a handful of war crimes by the PDFs, but we can't have any false equivalencies between them and the military because the scale is so different. The PDFs have made mistakes. There have been occasions where the NUG has done investigations and looked into it, and it's imperative that they keep doing so. They need to go out every day and juxtapose their own actions against the military's in order to maintain their moral high ground and their political legitimacy. You just cannot stoop to the level of the Sitat and what they are doing every day.
Mm. And I take the point that you're making, which is it's a horrific reality that war does not exist without war crimes. It's one would presume the stress and the extremity of being in combat situations, knowing that mortars could fall at any time, knowing that an ambush could happen at any time, drives people to act in unacceptable ways, and also that the scale is incomparable. Like absolutely, we would never say that the PDF have shot up churches and schools and hospitals and things that the military do on a regular basis. But I wonder, there is an expression that is going around on Burmese social media, which loosely translates to "now it's our turn," and this sense of the oppression that happened, not just since the coup of 1962, but in fact the military was already acting in bad faith, and certain Burmese governments were acting in bad faith towards minorities prior to the 62 coup d'etat. So for some of these people, it's been well over half a century of oppression, and the mentality that seems to circulate in some groups is, well, fair's fair. Now that we're fighting and now that we have the upper hand, it's not wrong for us to do it because it's still a microcosm of what it is that you've been doing to us. What would you comment on that particular line of reasoning?
I think the most important thing I would push back on or say to them is that it creates a very bad precedent. The PDFs are not going to militarily defeat the army. The army simply has too many men, too many resources. It has state sponsors in Russia and China and even India. What the PDFs need to do is hollow out the military, slowly wear it down through a war of attrition. They want to encourage defections, desertions, and if they mistreat prisoners of war, they're certainly not going to get the defections that they're hoping for. If this can be used by the military in their social media campaign and disinformation campaigns and trying to convince their soldiers, don't even think about defecting. This is what the PDFs will do to you. That's really counterproductive to what they're trying to achieve. It's so important, when we're talking about asymmetric warfare. It is so imperative that groups like the NUG maintain the moral high ground at all times. This is a battle for legitimacy. And I clearly understand the decades of egregious war crimes perpetrated by the military. Don't forget, their doctrine is based on the terrorizing the civilian population. They do not have a counterinsurgency doctrine based on winning the hearts and minds of the population, winning them over, good governance, development projects, and the like. Their four-cut strategy is based on terror, and they're doing it every day. And so the most clearly that the NUG can demarcate and draw a line that differentiates them from the military is so important. Again, I understand the stress of war. I understand the frustrations after a heated battle when your brothers and your comrades have been killed and you capture POWs. But they have to think long term, not short term.
I want to turn to a comment that you made in there. You said quite firmly that the PDF cannot defeat the Tatmadaw militarily. And in the previous two interviews that we had, we focused on the capacity and the strategy of the Tatmadaw and the capacity and the strategy of the PDF. And what we were getting, or rather what you were saying, is that the military have lost somewhere in the vicinity of 16, 17% of their actual combat capable staff. Defections are high, and a leading cause of that, perhaps more so than casualties, but that the PDF can readily shore up their numbers. Their actual total combined forces compare quite favorably to one another. It's the helicopters and the artillery and the tanks that the military have an advantage. But as you yourself pointed out, the replacement parts for helicopters are scarce. The jet fuel is scarce. The ammunition for artillery is apparently dwindling. So, with all that in mind, why exactly is it that you say that the PDF cannot win this in conventional military terms?
I just don't see them being able to defeat the military in a force-on-force campaign and march into Naypyidaw and take over. I just don't see that. What I have always thought the path to victory for the NUG is that they hollow out the military. They're fighting on so many different fronts that they logistically can no longer fight. They don't have the manpower. They don't control the roads effectively. They can't move forces from one front to another, that they simply wear away. They're depleted because of casualties. I can't think of a military out there whose leadership is as callous and willing to use their troops as just cannon fodder the way the Burmese military is. It's their callous disregard for their own casualties is going to undermine them in the long run. My belief is the way the NUG wins is that you get enough colonels and one-star generals who are actually in charge of running this war, who understand that it cannot be done. Logistically, they simply do not have the manpower, that they do not have the supplies. They cannot resupply their forces. They're becoming too dependent on artillery and airstrikes, but they can't control actual ground. They can terrorize the population. They can burn villages. They're certainly going on a dry season offensive right now in Saigon. But at the end of the day, you get that kind of mid-management of the military who realize that this cannot be won and that the military leadership has led them to a defeat. And if they are going to salvage the military's place in the economy, in politics, or even society, you get those generals who are trying to find a negotiated settlement with the NUG. And that's kind of how this ends.
So I know this is an impossible question to answer, but I'm curious. Do you have any sense of what that tipping point is, because the guys you're talking about, colonels and 1-star generals, those are quite high up. Like, we've seen defections of lieutenants, of captains, even occasionally something around the level of a major, but defections of generals, that's not really something that, to my knowledge, we're seeing. We might be a while off from that. So what are the losses, or what is the logistic defeat that would trigger people of that level, the general staff, starting to say, you know what, I'm actually better off with the PDF, even though my own military will put a bounty on my head the moment I do it?
Right. So maybe I wasn't clear enough. Let me try to explain. What would cause the tipping point? I think if the NUG and the PDFs are able to survive this coming year, if they can survive a dry season offensive, if they can maintain the working alliance with the different affiliated EROs, I think that will, play such an important role that they are part of the firmament. The military knows that they cannot defeat the PDFs, who now control, with the EROs, over half the country, at least effective control. Meanwhile, the economy will continue to tank. The economy collapsed 18% in 2021. Inflation is soaring in Myanmar. The economy is hard hit. Exports other than oil and gas are down. The government is having trouble raising revenue. The two military-owned conglomerates are in such duress they haven't paid their dividends now for 2 years. So we know they're cash strapped. Foreign investment really is not coming into the country in significant amounts. It's still, unfortunately, going in. So I think there you will get a small group of kind of junior generals and some colonels who are in charge of this war, actually executing this war, who come to the determination that it cannot be won, and decide to cut their losses and save themselves. I'm not sure exactly when it happens. Obviously, and we've talked about this before, the number of defections across the military is still quite low. And it's quite low because of what the military has done to make it very difficult and very costly to defect. The military lives on bases. Entire families live in cantonments. The people bank in the military-owned banks. So, if people are trying to withdraw their life savings, the military will know something's up. They use their cell phones from Mitel or Mitel. So the military is tracking their movements. They are tracking their communications. They live in their own little media bubble, shut off from the rest of society. So the military really has been able to prevent defections in mass. It's happened, and sometimes we've seen entire units defect. But still, the number of defections is disappointing. They're important. I think we should be encouraging them. I think the international community should be providing greater financial assistance to encourage this, and to support the media and social media operations to encourage those defections, but still small numbers. But I come back to this idea that the military is not likely to be defeated, but it will be hollowed out to the point that it is no longer an effective fighting force.
Because one of the lessons that I've learned, like, obviously I've never been in a military context, but when you play even strategy games, there's a hard lesson that you learn early on, which is consistently making advantageous moves is not sufficient. You actually have to have a pathway to a victory. You have to have an idea of how that victory is going to look, and you need to know what steps are going to get you to that specific victory. A series of individually good looking decisions does not magically confer victory. And that's sort of how I've looked at the conflict. The military has a lot of advantages. They've taken a lot of very bold steps, and some of them have led to strategic upper hand for them in certain areas. But what I keep coming back to is this question: does the military have a pathway to a victory scenario? And I can't for the life of me see how they could possibly succeed in this conflict.
The military does have a path to victory, or they think they do. I'm not sure I completely agree with it, and it's not that complicated. First is to continue to do what they're doing on the ground, uh, terrorizing the population, trying to convince them not to support the NUG and the PDFs. So far, that hasn't worked, and it's obviously frustrating to them. For over 40 years, they have been able to terrorize the population into submission. And this is the first time that the population across the country has, defied the military. The second thing that they intend to do is to hold elections next August. Now, these are going to be shambolic elections, but they will probably be enough for some members of the international community. Obviously, China and Russia and India will kind of sign off on them, but even some members of ASEAN are going to likely sign off and say, good enough. Japan and South Korea may sign off on them and say, okay, time to get back to business. I'm absolutely terrified of this, that the military is going to be able to hold elections and enough of the international community will kind of look at it and say, all right, they're no longer a military dictatorship. Let's get back to trade and investing. The third path to victory for the military is to go after the NUG's center of gravity. And that center of gravity is the NUG's relationship with the different EROs. That is their strength. There's never been such coordination between an ethnic Burman-led organization like the NUG. It's still preponderantly Burman, and the different EROs. Is it perfect? No, but never before have you had such close coordination. And the military knows that. And they are trying, and you can say they're not doing a very good job at this, but they're constantly still having peace talks. They're flying up different commanders from EROs to Tatmadaw for these peace talks. They're trying to peel one group away, trying to bribe them, give them autonomy agreements, revenue sharing. So far, they haven't been able to do this that effectively, but I would get people to pay attention to what happened recently with the ceasefire with the Arakan army. Now, the Arakan army never has joined with the NUG. There's not a formal alliance, but the NUG certainly benefited from the hostilities in Rakhine between the military and the Arakan army. It was a new front for the military. They had to deploy 40,000 troops there. It was costly. They had to deploy air assets there. And those are all finite resources. And so when you have the ceasefire, even if it's a very tenuous one, it allows the military to once again redeploy forces to move their air assets to other regions. And then they can kind of put pressure on the Arakan army to stop arming some of the PDFs in Sagaing. And that starts to create mistrust and unhappiness within the NUG leadership, right? They thought, oh, we really thought the Arakan army was with us, a new front. Nope, they're acting in their own narrow self-interest. And the military knows that, given amount of time, they can go back to divide and conquer. That, these groups will tire of fighting and they can kind of go in to one group at a time and start to cut deals. And so that's the military's path to victory. It's a 3-step process, but they think they can wait this out. And the sad thing is, it's not a crazy path to victory. They really think that they can kind of use their troops as cannon fodder. They don't care about casualties. They think they will continue to get economic and military support from China, from India, from Russia. They're hopeful that ASEAN will remain feckless and divided. And they're hoping that the historical mistrust between the Burman population and the ethnic resistance organizations starts to manifest and break apart that alliance.
I mean, it makes sense. Although, again, when we just look at the cold hard realities, in fact, I mean, you yourself in this interview you said that it's a question of can the NUG and the PDF survive the dry season offensive. You're almost suggesting that it's a war of attrition, and it's just who can hold on longer, who can keep going for that extra couple of months on both sides. And so you mentioned the election, and I want to talk about that because this is something that they've been signaling for a long time, and it's something that we all know is going to be fraudulent. When we look at the way the military handled the 1990 election, which was a legitimate election, and they annulled the results and arrested the opposition leaders. When we look at the way that they faked the results of the 2008 constitutional referendum, when we look at the way that they rigged the terms of the 2010 election and goaded the NLD into boycotting, no matter what tactic they're going to use, the end result is going to be that the military will declare victory. But it's an interesting strategy, because when they rig the terms of the election, if the NLD refuses to participate, and in order to participate, they have to register with the military-controlled electoral commission. If the NLD refuses to participate, the military narrative will be that the NLD does not actually want to engage in democracy, and because they didn't participate in the election, they cannot be the legitimate government. If the NLD does participate, the election will be rigged, the NLD will lose, and then the military will say, well, they tried, they lost, the democratic will of the people is that the military dictatorship should stay. And anyone who opposes that is clearly undemocratic and cannot be trusted. So it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. So is there a good strategy for the democratic parties in facing this election?
No, there isn't. I think you identified the problems really well. Immediately after the coup, I wrote a few pieces and said you have to understand that they are going to emulate what the Thai military did following their 2014 coup, and between the elections they held in 2019, and what the Thai's military did in drafting a new constitution. They created an upper house that the military appointed, 100% of the 250 seats. They engaged in gerrymandering, malapportioned the vote. They banned political parties. They saddled opposition figures with jail terms, with legal cases against them. They controlled the media. They used the Computer Crimes Act. They used lèse-majesté charges to silence dissent. They used their monopoly of control over the election commission to basically come up with their proportional representation and partyless seat plan. And we can see the Union Election Commission in Myanmar kind of copy every one of those things. Everything from establishing proportional representation to arresting the NLD leadership, even mid-level people, just keeping them out, threatening to dissolve the NLD. Their thorough control of social media and the airwaves. The fact that the Union Election Commission is completely controlled by the military. They won't just have their thumb on their scale. They will be standing on it with an armload of bricks. This is going to favor the military's party. So we know that these elections are going to be shambolic. There's going to be nothing free and fair about them. So the question for the NUG is, do you have a nationwide strike and sit it out? What happens if the military then starts going house to house and at the barrel of a gun, forcing people to vote and killing them if they don't? We have the whole question, the military really doesn't control almost half the country. So what's that going to mean? The elections are really fraught. And I'm quite concerned that as bad as they're going to be, the international community, as I said before, is going to say, good enough, and get back and allow that to legitimize a military junta light. What's so important, and probably the best thing we can do right now, is to have countries like the United States, Australia, Japan, and in particular, the ASEAN states come out and unequivocally state, we will not recognize the results of a shambolic election. It was heartening a few weeks ago when the Malaysian Foreign Minister Saifuddin came out and said just that in very forceful terms. Unfortunately, he's no longer the foreign minister. Elections have consequences, and there's a new foreign minister from the old UMNO party, and I'm expecting a much more traditional, less confrontational approach from Malaysia in the future. We don't know whether President Widodo of Indonesia, now the president, the rotating president of ASEAN, is going to come out and unequivocally reject the polls if they are held in August. It would be wonderful if he came out immediately and preemptively rejected them. We'll see. Foreign policy has never been a priority for him, but he has been critical of the military. So we'll see. But we really need the international community to be in lockstep about this and make very clear that sham elections are not a pathway for international legitimacy and normalization of this barbaric military regime.
I mean, I agree with the principle behind what you're saying, but as you noted, when the election first came up, countries like China, countries like Russia are inevitably going to use this, whether or not there is a pro-democracy country unilateral move. Oh, no, sorry, not unilateral. Omnidirectional move to discount this election. Those countries who want to engage with Myanmar are going to use it as an excuse to do so, whether this is for the purposes of arms shipments or military training, or whether it's for the purpose of economic investment or more likely economic exploitation. They're going to do it. If anything, an argument will inevitably be made that if other countries do not recognize the legitimacy of the election and they refuse to engage with Myanmar, this gives bad faith actors and dictatorial countries a monopoly over the economic and political and strategic opportunities that Myanmar represents. So, for example, if China and India hate each other, if India looks at the situation not so much in terms of the ethics of recognizing this election, but in terms of the strategy of a very pro-China ally developing on its eastern border, India, for reasons of survival and self-defense, might say, well, we know the election was a sham, but we also need to cut off Chinese influence into Myanmar. So, like, would you agree that it's inevitable that these elections are going to be used by certain countries, particularly dictatorial bad faith actors, as an excuse to ramp up their engagement with the military and to help prop up the military regime in the future?
Yes, I completely agree with that. And I would take it further and say there are countries that aren't even bad faith actors that really should be more responsible and more critical, like South Korea, like Japan, who will probably uh, 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 begin to allow those elections to normalize a a post-military regime, um, even if it's the generals simply taking off their uniforms.
Why would that be? I wonder, like, I mean, South Korea has had its history with military dictatorship as well. Um, one would presume that they would be very wary of military dictatorships popping up and being supported within their general neighborhood. So why would you say that South Korea and Japan in particular are likely to recognize such elections?
Um, I hope I'm wrong. I really do. South Korea, as you mentioned, came out of a military dictatorship from 1961 until 1988. Um, so this is their democratic transition is within living memory, and of all the countries that really should know better and be more supportive of a people's movement against a brutal military dictatorship, it's the South Koreans. The problem is the dominance of the large conglomerates, the Chaebol, and their investments in Southeast Asia in general and Myanmar in particular. Um, this has been an important place for investment for them, and I think they want to get back to making money. Um, Japan is another frustrating case, and the Japanese founded the Tatmadaw. They created the Burmese military before the country was founded, and they just have this attachment to it. They believe that they have influence over it. That they trained Aung San, and it still permeates their thinking to this day. Ever since the coup, the US government has not been able to get the Japanese to support sanctions. Japan was slow to come out and condemn the junta. They had a real wait and see attitude that hopefully the demonstrations, the civil disobedient movement will pass and kind of we can get back and do business. Toyota wants to expand their manufacturing there. And of course, the Japanese have a real concern that if they are too harsh on the generals and begin to sanction them, that they're ceding the country to greater Chinese influence, which the Japanese really don't want. Um, Neither South Korea nor Japan have ever had democracy or human rights protection as a cornerstone of their foreign policies. And it really shows in the case of Myanmar. Um, I have argued to the Japanese that, look, there are really two things you care about in Myanmar, and that is you want political stability and you want sound economic stewardship. And this junta gives you neither. They are waging a multi-front war against their population. They do not control half the country. There is instability. There's violence, political violence in Yangon and other cities. And look at what they have done to the economy. They have absolutely tanked it. And I've tried to make the case to the Japanese that everything you want, the junta is undermining. And so you really need to revisit your policy. So we'll see. The Japanese are slow to change their policies, and they don't like to have to reverse them when their policies have failed.
I mean, that sounds pretty familiar. But then, so this puts us in an awkward position. So what we're looking at seems to be quite a few countries, even countries that are now democratic, are not particularly pro-dictatorship or pro-human rights abuse, whether directly or indirectly, are likely to support the military. And those bad faith actors and the dictatorial countries that we have are directly supporting the military. We just saw this last week, I think, the delivery of 6 new fighter jets from China to the military. We've seen consistently huge supplies of whether it's armaments or whether it's spare parts, whether it's just material in general from Russia. And there have been allegations of Iran sending supplies. The jet fuel, as I think you've pointed out in the past, is coming across the border from India. So there are quite a few states that are very directly doing business with the SAC, providing them with the tools that they need to continue this conflict. And yet simultaneously, there seems to be a phenomenal hesitation on the side of seemingly pro-freedom, pro-democracy countries to provide any comparable form of materiel or military support to whether the NUG, whether the EAOs, whether the PDF, whether whatever acronym we're using this week. What seems to be underlying this disconnect?
So yes, the Chinese are still selling weapons, and especially some of the larger platforms, jet fighters, to Myanmar. Russia continues to sell weapons, though one has to wonder at the rate at which they are burning through their munitions and arsenal, whether they will be able to sustain this. Myanmar is a loyal client, but it's not a particularly large one or an important one for Russia. And India continues to sell weapons. The jet fuel is still coming into the country through the ports. It's coming overland from India. And the new Chinese jet fighters are going to be deployed in northern Shan State, which raises the concern that you are going to start getting jet fuel imports from across the border from China. So the support for the junta is still there. And that is just not going to change right now. I cannot comment on Iranian support, but you could clearly imagine them or other actors being willing to enter that space. So that begs the question then, why has the West not provided lethal assistance? And it's absolutely inexplicable. The NUG is a legitimate government. They have the support of the population. They provide the only path forward for a country in terms of establishing a democratic federal system that has the potential. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but has the potential to bring a durable peace to this country that has been at war with itself since its independence in 1948. So I can make a very clear and compelling argument why the NUG should receive lethal assistance. But I can also give you all the reasons why it's not going to happen. And I'm not happy about this. Countries like the United States have armed and supported very illegitimate groups in the past, very thuggish groups. We have supported groups that have gone back to bite us in the ass later on. And yet here you have a group that's really trying to create a stable and prosperous and independent state founded on democracy, on federalism. This is a country that we could really easily influence. So let's go through some of the reasons why it has not gotten lethal assistance. For one thing, the European countries, Australia, Japan, really don't have a long history of supporting groups like the NUG, sub-state actors. So that kind of takes a large number of states right off the table. This is just not something they're comfortable doing. The United States could do it, but, Myanmar is so peripheral to the United States in terms of our interests. Sure, there's some American corporate investment in the country, but very little. Is there a Burmese diaspora in the United States? Sure, but they're spread across 50 states. You don't have a critical mass. You don't have a real strong lobby in Congress. I think one of the real problems for Myanmar and the NUG is that the situation in the country is so incredibly complex. To get American policymakers to sit there and try to understand the relationship between the NUG, the various EROs, the ones that are with the NUG, the ones who are taking a wait-and-see approach, those who are actually bandwagoning with the junta. It's an incredibly complex picture. And so when they would sit there and start to think about, well, who would we arm? That becomes very difficult. There's the real concern, certainly in the United States, that some EROs have been deeply involved in illicit narcotic production. And no policymaker wants to be called out for a vote in which they voted for the supply of lethal assistance to a group that is now flooding the global drugs markets with methamphetamine and ketamine and all sorts of other synthetic drugs. That's been and you can say, look, the NUG is not involved in illicit narcotics. No one's willing to take that risk. then you get other problems. If you were to wanted to supply the NUG with lethal assistance, how would you get it there? Thailand's not going to allow you into the border regions. They barely allow the United States to have humanitarian corridors to support refugees. China's not going to allow it. India's not going to allow it. Maybe Bangladesh, but I doubt Bangladesh would allow it. So there are logistical problems with this. You know, and finally, the war in Ukraine, which you mentioned, it's like if the Americans can spend $25 billion there, why can't we spend a fraction of that in Myanmar? And again, I could make a very compelling case of why Myanmar and the NUG deserve lethal assistance. I can also tell you that in terms of military equipment and munitions, the Ukrainians are burning through everything we can supply them. We cannot manufacture quickly enough. No one was expecting a war of this scale. Our industrial base, as large as it is, they produce on a month right now less than the number of artillery shells that Ukraine is going through in a 5-day period. So we're actually running down our own reserves. And the US military is actually starting to push back on supplying Ukraine with weapons because they're saying, well, what if we have a war and we need those weapons? There's just, in short, there's going to be no international lethal assistance for the NUG. Now, it's not all bad, and let me explain why. The first is there are weapons to be had. There are black markets, in fact, very large black markets for arms due to the long history of insurgency, poor governance, illicit narcotics. So the NUG is able to purchase weapons. Now they're paying a lot more for them. Demand has certainly driven up the costs. So the NUG's limited finances are not going as far as they used to. The most important source of weapons for any guerrilla group is actually what they capture on the battlefield. And the NUG and their PDFs have done a very good job with that and are really starting to equip forces across the country. And that, of course, leads to more battlefield victories, which should in turn lead to more captured weapons and ammunition. Some of the EROs are able to manufacture their own ammunition. That is available to the NUG. It costs money. So I don't think it's an international weapons problem. I think it's more of a resource and financial problem, that war is just really costly. The NUG can raise $40 million in bond sales and or through the sale of properties owned by the military in these preemptive auctions. But $40 million doesn't go very far when you're trying to arm 50,000 men to take on the military.
I mean, everything you're saying, it makes sense, but it's just the thing that was going through my mind the whole time you're talking is just this concept of the what I can only term as the hypocrisy of notionally pro-democratic countries, the same countries who stand in line to condemn a coup, who stand in line to condemn the executions of activists, the same countries who are sending strongly worded letters of condemnation to the Iranian regime right now, are not willing to do anything, like when it comes down to it. And yet those countries whose policy is don't complain about my human rights abuses and I won't complain about yours, they're actually willing to put materiel on the table. Yes, they might be doing it for very self-interested purposes. They're still getting money out of it. They're not giving it for free and for the sake of the love and the kindness. But you talk about the crimes that the drug trade that the PDF is associated with. That just reminded me of when the United States was supporting the Contras in Nicaragua, and they once again, it was the same thing. The Contras were moving cocaine, and so it became politically infeasible to support them. And yet Reagan and Oliver North still conspired to sell weapons illegally to Iran to raise funds to continue supporting the Contras because they believed, for whatever reason, that supporting the Contras against the I think it was the Sandinistas was the right thing to do. So it proves that there are those cases where even when political will turns against what a government is doing to support one side in a foreign conflict, you do occasionally have characters who are willing to stand up and say, "No, I'm doing this anyway. We're going to." Yes, they sell drugs, but we believe it's the lesser of two evils. Now, yes, the Iran Contra affair was horrifically controversial and highly, highly illegal. But it just goes to that point of there have been these times in history where Western nations have said, "We're doing this because we're doing this, and I don't care if it's not politically popular to do it." And now in the 21st century, it just seems to be, well, we're not comfortable with it. We don't really know who they are. There are allegations of misconduct. There are allegations of drug trafficking. And it's like, does that stack up to an attack helicopter leveling a primary school? Are these two things even remotely comparable? Both are bad, but there are levels of bad. And it seems like they're equivocating and saying, well, if one side is a little bit bad, then the other side can commit literal genocide, and it's still just bad guys versus bad guys, so we better not touch it. Like, what is it? Is it just this fear of getting your hands dirty at all? Like, are they waiting for a perfect white knight that they can stand behind, or what's going on here?
The hypocrisy is real. You've identified it, and I cannot disagree with it. Again, I would come back to interests. Myanmar is a long way from the United States. We don't do a lot of trade, very limited investment, small diaspora community in America, not politically connected. They don't have great supporters within Congress, champions for the cause. I think it's also important that, after Aung San Suu Kyi went to The Hague to defend her military, her captors, before the Rohingya genocide, that really burnt bridges with the West. And right now, even with all the different court cases against her and absolute kangaroo court stuff and baseless charges, boy, in the West, you don't even hear her name. The sympathy for her, democracy icon, human Nobel Prize laureate, you don't hear that anymore. And so there's not even this one figure that the international community can really focus on. And karma's a bitch. And that has really proven disastrous for the international community. No one's going to come out and say, let's do this for Suu Kyi. She's under arrest against the barbaric military. The point you were making, though, that the authoritarian regimes will come to the aid of Myanmar is exactly right. Birds of a feather flock together. They all have a vested interest in the continuation of a fellow authoritarian's hold on power. The ending of an authoritarian regime, the spread of democracy is a potential contagion to them. And so they will always provide material assistance to fellow authoritarians. The West just is unwilling to get involved in Myanmar, even if they will come out and publicly state that the NUG is the legitimate government of the people and should be given greater representation. But that's about as far as everyone's willing to go right now.
But it feels like where is the nuance? Because I understand what you're saying. You're completely correct. But why has politics become as one-dimensional as the 24-hour news cycle is? Why is it that we cannot look at Aung San Suu Kyi and say, your active participation in the denial of the ongoing Rohingya genocide is despicable? And we understand that you were doing it for your domestic political career. You were doing it because your voter base were largely misled and misinformed by the military. But let's be honest, deep down, you knew exactly what was going on, and you allowed it to continue, while simultaneously also recognizing that she is on the chopping block as a scapegoat for the military. Her treatment is unjustifiable, and the will of the people of Myanmar is being completely and totally ignored and subverted. Why can't we recognize both of these things to be true and act on both of these things accordingly? Why is it just one thing?
Yeah. I wish that we could have such nuance, and it just doesn't exist, certainly with policymakers. Really, I don't have an answer to that. Boy, it's so unfortunate in this case because without Suu Kyi, she's the only person that policymakers in Europe or the United States or Australia could readily identify. And not having that unifying force, that one person who could command, that charismatic figure that can command international attention and respect, has been really devastating for the NUG.
It's the power of symbols is just, this is not relevant to anything. It's just a fascinating thing. Having a symbol is great as a centralizing, unifying force, something to rally around. But it's a double-edged sword, because the more you invest in your symbols, the easier it is to undermine a movement by tarnishing those symbols or by removing those symbols. And it pains me if what you're telling me is that it is not just a symptom of our society and of the media cycle, but that this is an endemic mentality among the people who actually make and implement government policies, that they too are more interested in symbols and slogans than in carefully considered strategy and the potential impacts of their action, or in this case, inaction. Because we would really expect better of the people who hold lives in their hands than we expect of the average punter watching the 6 o'clock news. But increasingly, it seems that we can't expect better.
And it's too bad that we need these one individuals that we can kind of glob onto, because we really need to be focusing on building up institutions, not these individuals, because the individuals will always let you down at some point. You know, for all that she did, there the NLD certainly did not uh, have a good transition of leadership to a new generation. They did not empower a new generation of leaders that they really needed. Um, so that's a problem, and uh, certainly in America, we get much too close to an individual and the personalization of policy.
Mm, absolutely. And I think what you're pointing out there, I think it continues. I think it's pervasive within the national unity government now as well. Transition of power is not really culturally present. There's a very strong sentiment, and I'm not sure whether it was you who mentioned this in a previous interview. The culture of sacrifice that Myanmar culture, Myanmar political culture, revere the idea that those who protested in 1988 and those who suffered, those who were targeted, those who were imprisoned and tortured, they deserve respect. But more than respect, they deserve positions of leadership. And the sad reality is that what what worked in 1988 does not necessarily work in 2022. And we need to make way for other people, different thinking, different approaches, different styles, um, and people who are not sort of in the political ivory tower. As strange as it might be to talk about the NUG in those terms, considering the conflict, but it is a problem that a lot of people complain about. So what can we talk, like, transitioning to the NUG now that we're looking at about 2 years almost post conflict or post coup? What is the state of the NUG as a functioning government? What has it done, and what does it still need to do?
Um, I give the NUG pretty high marks for what they've been able to do. Not all their ministries. There have been differences, but let me start with the fact that they stood this up and they got buy-in from the public. That every day, I can kind of flip through Twitter in the morning and see civil disobedience movements from Kachin State down to Mun State to Rakhine. Every day, people are out there supporting the NUG, believing that it is the legitimate government. That's the most important thing. The second thing is they have formed this alliance with various ethnic resistance organizations, and they have presented a roadmap to a durable political future for the country based on democracy and federalism, power sharing with the different ethnic groups. So now I can be very critical that the actual constitution or getting to a constitutional convention is a long way off. I think they're really making a mistake in not expediting the drafting of such documents. The NUG's Ministry of Finance has done a phenomenal job in fundraising for this revolution. They have been creative. They have been tech savvy. They have used technology to issue crypto bonds. They have been fun and playful in the auctioning off of military-owned properties or illegally appropriated properties. They have tapped into the patriotism and the nationalism of the population. The bonds pay zero yield. So people are not buying those bonds for an investment. It is a patriotic responsibility. People are paying money that they will not they might not ever get repaid, but they're doing it as a sign of the NUG's legitimacy. The Ministry of Finance has really had to think hard about how to move money from overseas, from from Europe or Australia or America back. They have had to figure out how to create the NUG pay. So, because of what the military did, through their absolute gutting of the banking system, so many of the e-wallets or e-commerce broke down. And so the NUG is trying to create an alternative to that. So I think they deserve very high marks. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is doing a good job. They are getting more representative offices. Just a couple weeks ago, they opened one up here in Washington, D.C. They are not getting the diplomatic recognition that they want, but they've done a good job in denying the military junta the representation they crave. They've done a pretty good job at communicating to the international community, quietly lobbying, being on the sidelines of the U.S. ASEAN summit. They've done a good job in trying to keep the UN seat now held by Ambassador Chomutun. So they are doing a lot with limited resources. And then, you get some of the other ministries that are trying to, for the messaging about war crimes. I think there's much more that the Ministry of Information could do in terms of keeping the messaging going. But, they're doing an adequate job in terms of getting their message out about what's happening in Myanmar. Not perfect, but not bad by comparable standards. The thing to really watch in the coming year is how well, especially in the regions they control, that they are able to stand up a shadow government and provide some basic services. Education is the most important thing they can do. It does create that bond between the people and the state. But they also have to provide health care. We are still in a global pandemic. There are new variants of COVID-19 rearing their head all the time. And Myanmar is really a public health black hole right now. So they have that role. Increasingly, they're trying to do some policing and establish a court system. And again, they have very limited resources to do this. The international community is not going to provide lethal assistance to the NUG, but boy, in terms of their provision of social services and medical care, education, I think there's so much more that the international community not only can do, but should do.
Absolutely. But then, so I think we brought this up in one of the previous interviews that neither one of us was able to think of any government or shadow government, or whatever term we want to use, that has existed under similar conditions to the NUG and has achieved anything anywhere near the scale of what the NUG has achieved. And certainly there needs to be a lot of praise for the NUG and for a lot of the external partners that have been willing to work with the NUG, um, whether they were paid or in some cases external partners who don't want to be named and who also have worked for free charitably, to try and provide assistance to the NUG. That there's certainly been a not inconsiderable amount of goodwill and charity from NGOs, from private enterprises, from government actors, whoever the case may be. But I think it's important that we look at, are there concrete steps or changes that the NUG needs to make? You mentioned the constitution, that they need to start taking that much more seriously, and they need to accelerate that process. Is there anything else that you would say the NUG needs to really um, focus more resources on, or change their approach to, in order to not give the military some sort of leverage or a toehold or something?
I think it's important that they focus on those basic provisions of social service simply because the military regime has done such a terrible job in providing those social services, education, healthcare. Um, the military has really failed as a state. They have trouble collecting taxes. There's massive tax avoidance. People are really trying not even to pay their electric bills. Um, so no one trusts the military to be competent stewards of the economy. Um, so I think that the NUG simply focuses on those provision of basic social services is the most important thing they can do right now, other than fight and win a war.
And so you've mentioned the economy, and you've mentioned the economy a few times today, and that's probably the ultimate topic that we're going to gravitate to in this interview. But let's seriously talk about the economy more broadly. Of course, this topic is what happens post victory, because in so many conflicts, whether we're talking about interstate wars, whether we're talking about internal conflicts, revolutions, coups d'etat, so on, the question is always, well, how are we going to win? The question is very often not, what are we going to do once we've won? And you see so many cases where there's victory and then there's this moment of like, okay, but so what now? How do we fix things? It's not just transitioning to stable government. In the case of Myanmar, we've seen, and on this podcast, we've interviewed other people who've spoken to us about the labor industry, and the state of the unions, the state of factories, who have spoken about the raising of agricultural land, who have spoken about the rampant overexploitation, parasitic overexploitation of natural resources under the junta's control. The power sector is in crisis and has been in crisis for decades. Obviously, malaria is running rampant, tuberculosis is running rampant, COVID-19 is running rampant, although it's no longer front page news anymore. To the people who are suffering with it, it certainly still is. All of these factors combine to show us a picture of a country that is at least a decade behind where it was pre-coup. And what 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 can be done? How can this be salvaged if industries are not operating, if there's no economy, if there's no outside investment? Like, will Myanmar just come out of conflict only to stagnate in abject poverty, or is there a path forward?
Boy, you framed that in as grim terms as I can imagine, but you're not wrong. If the NUG won and took over tomorrow, they would be inheriting a hell of a mess. The junta and their actions and their just abject incompetence um, has decimated the economy. They eviscerated 10, 12 years of rapid economic growth in a matter of months. The economy contracted 18% last year. Inflation is in double digits right now. Currency controls have limited imports, including fertilizers, which has impacted agriculture. The war has destroyed infrastructure, roads, communications networks, and they were never that well off to begin with. It's dried up much foreign investment, and the foreign investors going in now really deserve greater scrutiny because they are actively engaging with a military regime. So the economy's just a mess. The chat lost 60% of its value at one point. The ability for the government to service debts, their international debts now has increased because of the devaluation of the currency. And don't forget, just this fall, the Financial Action Task Force put Myanmar on their blacklist for money laundering. And what this determination has done is it basically means that they cannot trust the Myanmar government to police itself, to investigate its financial networks. And what they're really saying is that the economy of Myanmar is a criminal enterprise. The government is a criminal enterprise that cannot control the vast amount of illicit money in the country. The FATF blacklist is not a sanction. It does not prevent companies from going in and investing in Myanmar, but it certainly makes the costs of doing so much higher. They will have to report every financial transaction they do. They will have to make sure, and their compliance officers will have to ensure that whoever they're doing business with are not engaged in money laundering. So it simply raises the transaction costs for businesses, and many are not going to want to be there. And certainly the reputational costs of being in a FATF blacklisted state. The only other two are North Korea and Iran. So it's not great company to be in. So, the economy is really in bad shape. And, it's still largely an agrarian economy. And, agricultural yields are down, exports are down. And I think sometimes we forget that, farmers are always living just on the edge of being able to sustain themselves. Their subsistence is always just so in doubt. They can suffer one bad crop, one bad harvest, but very few farmers have the wherewithal to withstand 2 or 3 bad harvests in a row. And that's kind of where you're going to get due to the breakdown in markets, the breakdown in available capital to farmers, the lack of imports of fertilizers and pesticides. So there's, I wouldn't even know where competent economists and economic managers would even begin right now. At least the NUG is comprised of competent, thoughtful managers, which is not the case of the junta. They'll put any lieutenant colonel in charge of something, including in the central banks. the central bank. They're not looking for competence or stewardship. They're looking for loyalty.
But then, I mean, obviously, we're not going to solve the problem of Myanmar's imminent economic collapse in a podcast, but there must be some idea of what is feasible. Like, is the most important question, I think, because this determines the dichotomy of investigation. Is it possible, even theoretically, for Myanmar, following the coup, to rebuild the economy and to catch up with the Southeast Asian community in terms of economy and in terms of development without external training, support, and funding?
They would get that support and funding. Um, I go back to think about where the country was in 2008, 2009, and what was achieved. The technical assistance provided by Japan, the EU, the United States, the role the private sector played. Um, it- Myanmar will rebuild from this, but to be very clear, the coup and the policies since then have reversed 10, 12 years of positive economic growth. And it's going to take a while for the country to catch up. I am confident that with good leadership that are committed to the country's long-term economic growth, the goodwill of the donor community, and just the desire of the people of Myanmar to reverse, these lost few years with the junta. I think that the country can rebound. But one point I've been trying to make is that for the junta, their greatest liability right now is the economy. Yes, they're losing militarily, but their real liability is the economy, because they were hoping that you would have enough people in the urban middle class who would basically accept the coup, not put up much of a fight, as long as there was sustained economic growth. And that's just not true. People are losing their savings because of the collapse of the economy. They are losing their opportunities to send their children to universities abroad. They are losing opportunities to engage in business. They're watching their savings get depleted because of inflation and the devalued chat. Businesses that were agnostic on politics, that thought, well, we can do business with the military. We know how they do business. We know they're corrupt, but at least it's somewhat predictable. None of those things are true. It's the military has to be very concerned that people they assumed would accept the coup are really getting hurt in their own wallets by the coup.
It's such a strange thing. We're trying to get into the mind of the military themselves, right? And none of this makes sense to most of us, to you or I or anybody else. Much of what has transpired, not everything, but much of what has transpired was reasonably evident. I did not believe, even Sunday, I went to bed on Sunday, the 31st of January 2021, confident that the new parliament was going to be sworn in. Obviously, I was following the events, but I was confident it was going to happen because I knew that the military controls key ministries. I knew that the military has complete autonomy. I knew that the military is free of oversight. I knew that the military controls MEC and MEHL and therefore basically monopolizes the entire economy for their own benefit. And I knew that the military was able to get away with a genocide without attracting any negative flack because they were able to throw a puppet civilian government to the international community's lions and watch Aung San Suu Kyi try to walk that tightrope while most people in the West didn't even know who Min Aung Hlaing is. And the idea of throwing all of that out of the window just so that Min Aung Hlaing could sit on the throne and pretend to be president was so outlandish and so absurd that it never occurred to me that they could seriously be that stupid. And I know a lot of people, intelligent people, who thought the same way, and we were all proven horrifically wrong, like catastrophically wrong in such a short space of time. Anthony Davis wrote an article in the first week of the coup when he said, "We are unlikely to see the bloodshed that was associated with the 1988 and the saffron revolutions because the military has become more media savvy." And I also believed that the military were not going to give the international community the excuse of murdering civilians. And I was catastrophically wrong. So when we talk about trying to get into the mentality of the military, it's such a difficult thing to do because they don't seem to act rationally. They don't seem to understand that their actions are not going to be accepted by people, that people are not going to lie down and take this, because when you're starving, well, you may as well fight because you're going to die of starvation or you're going to die being shot. But one of these might secure a slightly better future for your children. So I don't know. I've gone on a bit of tangent there, but it is there any chance that the military is actually going to really wake up and understand the genuine situation they find themselves in, or are they still living in a deluded bubble and are unpredictable?
Yeah, they certainly do live in a bubble, and a literal bubble in their fortress capital, that is so shut off from the rest of the country. Um, their actions really were irrational to so many of us. And as you described, they had control of three key ministries. They controlled their budget. They controlled their promotions and appointment. They had full autonomy. They got away with a genocide. They have these two conglomerates that dominate the economy. I mean, they had 25% of parliament, and yet that wasn't enough for them. They really felt threatened. Whether the NLD was getting close to 75%. We know that in 2019, 2020, the NLD was trying to amend the Constitution in a number of different votes. And they never got there. But certainly after the November 2020 elections, they were getting a lot closer. And that made the military nervous. When they made the decision to stage the coup, they were basing it on several assumptions. And I would make the case that many of those assumptions were flawed. But they assumed that the population would demonstrate for a couple days, maybe a couple weeks, but would come to terms and accept it. They were never expecting a multi-year civil disobedience movement. They never predicted that the NUG would stand up, or that they would be able to raise these 500 or so PDFs around the country who would actually fight and do okay and control territory. They never assumed that there could be a working relationship between a Burman-led NUG and the different EROs. The only thing they really assumed correctly was that the international community would not put that much pressure on them. They assumed that ASEAN would be divided and do very little. They assumed some countries would look the other way just for the sake of economic growth. They assumed that they would get the support of China and Russia and India. And they assumed that countries like America would have token sanctions, but not much else. It was their assumptions about the international context that proved correct. But boy, they got every other assumption fundamentally wrong. They assumed that they would be stewards of the economy. They never predicted that they would run it into the ground the way they did. So why did they make so many flawed assumptions? And it comes back to the bubble that these Min Aung Hlaing, So Win are surrounded by sycophants who tell them what they want to hear, not the truth. They are living in a fact-free environment. No one is giving them the honest assessments what's happening, and they're happy to rule the country and run it into the ground because they think it is their birthright to do so.
I mean, it's a very sobering assessment of the military's mentality, and unfortunately, it's something that it it always comes back to this. It always comes back to this mandate of heaven, exceptional mentality. I mean, we talk about the political philosophy of American exceptionalism, that because America is different, America can do things that other countries just can't do. But that's not even the same ballpark. It's not even the same sport as Tatmadaw exceptionalism. This idea that by the grace of divine providence, they and they alone defend the country, and they alone can make decisions for the country. And they have almost this childish rage and sense of offense that anyone would dare to question or challenge the authority that evidently was bestowed upon them by a higher power. There's this petulant hatred of anyone who questions them because they are in charge, because they've always been in charge and they're always meant to be in charge. It's difficult to try to rationalize and understand people who operate like this, because in order to maintain this worldview, they necessarily have to be divorced from reality, and they have to be divorced from concerns over the health of the economy and the welfare of the people and the sustainability of what it is they're doing in the country, because that would mean that there are concerns that are greater than the preservation of their own privileged status. Every time we have a conversation, it just seems to boil down to this fundamental concept that they're in power because they're in power, and they will continue to fight for it because they feel entitled to it. So is there any hope that they're actually going to walk away from power? Is there any hope for them to not try to go down in a blaze of gunfire and destroy as much of the country as they can in the process? Is there any hope for not a peaceful resolution, because we're too far for that, but at the very least for the high command to reach a point where they say, you know what, we'll quietly go into exile in China and Russia, and we'll walk away as long as you guarantee us amnesty? Like, can we hope for that to happen?
So let me go back to the point I was making before. Min Aung Hlaing is not going to gracefully bow out. I could see him really try to pursue this election strategy, and other hardline, even more hardline generals like So Win kind of say, "You're nuts. Why would we ever go back to anything democratic? We need direct military control. We're not going to adopt the Thai model." I could see kind of an internal putsch that, where someone like Min Aung Hlaing is put out to pasture, and the guys who say we've been too soft. What we really need to do is show the PDFs what we're made of, and really unleash their forces and the brutality on population, if that's even possible. But I have no doubt that there are a bunch of absolutely psychotic hardline generals that think Min Aung Hlaing has been too soft on the opposition, that things have gone too far, and the NUG is gaining too much strength. I could imagine an absolute orgy of violence after that happening, and things getting much worse before that kind of small hardline cabal falls. That's one scenario. But I would go back to the point I was making before of kind of those junior generals, the colonels who are in charge of running this war, basically saying this is absolutely unwinnable and seeking some negotiated settlement to preserve their ill-gotten gains, to try to preserve some of the military's privileged position in politics, in society, the economy, though they certainly don't deserve it. So I wish there was a clear pathway to getting Min Aung Hlaing to retire to China, and just I'm not seeing it yet.
I mean, that's unfortunate, but probably quite a realistic assessment. So I think we've covered quite a broad range of topics. So as is our custom, I'd just like to invite you to leave the audience with any thoughts that, based on our conversation today, or based on any other topics that we didn't have time for, you would like them to consider and mull over as they go about their day.
This year is going to be a really important one. We're coming up on the second anniversary of the coup, and the international community has a very short attention span. They're going to move on to the next crisis. And so it's so hard to keep Myanmar in the news, in the attention of policymakers around the world. After the execution of Ko Jimmy and the other 3 activists, there was just no response other than, verbal condemnation, no new rounds of sanctions. And I really worry that the international community is starting to drop the ball and pay less attention to Myanmar. As I said earlier, I'm very concerned that as fraudulent as elections next summer may be, that it will be good enough for many countries, and they will begin to normalize this regime. It's going to be hard for the NUG to continue to maintain their level of support from the people within the country, from the diaspora community around the world, especially if we head into a global recession. That will impact their resources. So, we're in for a critically important year coming up. We'll see whether Indonesia rises to the challenge and is going to lead ASEAN more effectively than Cambodia did. I certainly hope so. But it's very important that the NUG remain focused, that they really start to put together their constitutional convention to continue to hold that alliance together, knowing that the military is going to try to peel off the EROs one by one. So there are huge challenges coming up this year.
Many listeners know that in addition to running these podcast episodes, we also run a nonprofit, Better Burma, which carries out humanitarian projects across Myanmar. While we regularly post about current needs and proposals from groups on the ground, we also handle emergency requests, often in matters that are quite literally life or death. When those urgent requests come in, we have no time to conduct targeted fundraisers, as these funds are often needed within hours. So please consider helping us to maintain this emergency fund. We want to stress that literally any amount you can give allows us to respond more flexibly and effectively when disaster strikes. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause in both websites except credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.